Welcome, everyone. It is great and it gives me enormous pleasure to get this webinar started on a really important topic, justice and equity, and how can it be incorporated in the context of energy systems. And to get started, well, a decarbonized system, which is where hopefully we're heading, is not necessarily an equitable one. And so discussions on distributional effects and environmental justice are starting. There is a lot of emerging literature that captures some of those aspects, but we still don't know how to incorporate many of these dimensions in energy decisions. And so today we have a phenomenal set of speakers that focuses really on the core of those issues, and that will help us guide and learn from to understand where should research go and where should decision-making processes and policy insight head in the dimensions of justice and equity in energy systems. And so the organization for today will be that each of the panelists will speak for about 5 minutes. There will be a prompting question to do so. And then we look forward to a discussion and Q&A from the audience. So we're eager to receive your questions and comments in the chat, and I can just read those out loud. A little bit about our panelists. Welcome Professor Carley. She's a full professor in Paul O'Neill School of Public and Environmental Affairs at Indiana University, and she has been with Indiana University since 2010. Her research focuses on energy justice, as well as policies aimed at advancing innovation of low carbon and efficient energy technologies, both in the electricity and transportation sectors. In her most recent projects, she and collaborators have studied the incidence of energy insecurity amongst US households and the equity and justice dimensions of US energy transition. In addition to that, she has worked extensively and in numerous publications on other numerous energy policy related issues. She has received multiple awards on her teaching and mentoring, as well as recently the World Citizens Prize in Environmental Management in 2020. Welcome, Professor Carley. We welcome to Professor Mijin Cha, who is an assistant professor in urban and environmental policy at Occidental College. Professor Cha research and teaching interests are in the area of climate justice, environmental justice, labor movements, and the intersection of labor and climate justice. Dr. Cha is a fellow at Cornell University's Worker Institute, where she works on labor leading on climate initiative. Her recent research is on just transitions and how to transition workers and communities equitably into a low carbon future. Dr. Cha is also on the board of the Center on Race, Poverty, and the Environment, and a member of the California Bar. Welcome, Dr. Cha. And Professor Destenie Nock is an assistant professor in engineering and public policy, as well as in civil environmental engineering at Carnegie Mellon University. She has joined CMU after receiving her PhD in 2019 from the University of Massachusetts Amherst in industrial engineering and operations research. Her PhD work focused on multi-criteria decision analysis and applied optimization for energy planning options in New England and in sub-Saharan Africa. Dr. Nock's research interests are focused around using mathematical modeling tools to address societal problems related to sustainability planning, energy policy, equity, and engineering for social good. Not in her bio, but a shout out, she also maintains a phenomenal blog on guidance on both research and for junior faculty entering the research arena. I really encourage everyone to take a look at that. It's really phenomenal advice. And so with that, welcome everyone, and we'll get started. And our panelists were challenged to think about the following question. What work has been done to incorporate energy justice considerations into energy policy analysis? And moving forward, what are the metrics and objectives that we should be thinking about when designing policy with energy justice in mind? And with that, I'll give the floor to Professor Carley.
Wonderful. Thank you. Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you, Inês, for the kind introduction. Thank you all for hosting us as well. So I'm going to focus my 5 minutes of remarks on three things. One is, what is energy justice, just to lay the groundwork. The next is, what are some of the limitations of modeling tools that make it difficult to incorporate equity and justice? And third, what is being used to date and how can we continue to expand on it? So what is energy justice? Energy justice, the way that we often define it in the literature is through three things: distributive justice, procedural justice, and recognition. Distributive is about the distribution of benefits and burdens, where we have to ask questions such as, do some communities disproportionately bear the burdens of energy production more than others, such as air pollution near highways or power plants, noxious smells or traffic near biofuel facilities, mining conditions that are deleterious to personal health, and more. We also have to ask questions such as, do some experience inordinate impacts from energy consumption and prices, such as some families who might be more energy insecure than others? On the benefit side, we ask questions such as, does everyone have access to new, low carbon and efficient and cost-saving technologies that can help them save money and increase their own energy autocracy? And does everyone receive an appropriate share of government resources of the subsidies that go towards these technologies? Procedural justice thinks about who is allowed to participate, who's at the table, and who is allowed to lead. And here we think about issues of planning. Who are the employees? What kinds of legal processes and institutions include or exclude certain people? And are their voices heard? And when designing clean energy technologies and transitions, who's allowed to do the designing? Who's allowed to plan? And recognition justice thinks about who has historically and presently been burdened by our energy systems, and how do we engage and compensate and help these vulnerable frontline communities. So an energy justice framework means prioritizing these three aspects, asking these fundamental questions, identifying who is winning, who is not winning, who's losing, and to do so across the entire fuel life cycle of every single type of energy system. And I would say also just fundamentally, it's about prioritizing people, because people's lives matter and their livelihoods matter. So with that, why is it so challenging to incorporate these considerations into modeling? And just off the bat, I came up with four possibilities. One is scale. When it comes to modeling, rarely do we model individual people or households. We tend to use a much more aggregate or higher level scale. And even when we do model people or households, we often prioritize the aggregate of benefits, net costs, net technology gains, and so forth. But we rarely think about what are the so-called sacrifice zones, that are zones where people are disproportionately burdened, let's say, by the new technology that might be introduced as a result of the modeling practice. Second, this is a problem with modeling overall, and that is that the past is always our best information about the future. Right? When we build projections going forward, we tend to use past circumstances to build out that future scenario. And of course, we know that our past is fraught with energy inequities. And therefore, our future, if we are planning with the same vision and horizon, will also be fraught with such inequities. Third, the dimensions of these problems, the many problems within this space, transcend a single scope on energy systems. It also includes a scope and an understanding and accountability of public health and ethics and public policy and social justice, racial justice, and so much more. So we just can't limit our scope, and therefore it makes it even more difficult to model and build into analyses. And the fourth point is, prioritizing energy justice not only requires that we rethink the design of our models, but it also requires us to ask some pretty fundamental questions of ourselves as modelers, and to think deeply about the normative assumptions that we make as analysts, such as what discount rate to use and why. How do we account for future generations? Should we prioritize the needs of vulnerable populations? And how do we actually do so within our models? So what has been done to date, and I assume that we'll spend a lot of time talking about this. So this is just kind of a high level overview, and really kudos to other panelists as well for really pushing some of these different techniques. One is we're working on diversification of models to include more individual or household decision-making through different modeling frameworks, such as agent-based modeling and other techniques. Another is expanding on multi-criteria decision-making, such as some of Destinie's work with inserting stakeholder engagement in these decision-making processes. Another is inserting equity into objective functions that we build. And another is to design measures of vulnerability to identify which populations are most vulnerable, and to gather more data on some of these problems that we can use as inputs into our bigger analytic and modeling processes. Thank you.
It's great. Thank you so much, Professor Carley, and we'll move on to Professor Cha.
Thank you, everyone, and thank you for having me here today. And that was such a wonderful opening remarks from Professor Carley. So I'm going to focus a little bit more on the policy design aspect as a complement to the modeling aspect. And so when I think about, maybe we start with, why do we care about equity? And besides the fact that we all want to live in a more just world, when we think about the policies that we need to kind of reach the level of decarbonization that we need to stop the worst impacts of the climate change, this becomes a political problem and a political issue. And the bigger your coalition is, the more people that you can get to engage in your advocacy, the more power you build to then pass the policies that we can get that will get us to the decarbonization that we need. So when we think about equity, one way is to really think about broadening our political coalition so that people see their own concerns in the policy design and things that you are advocating for. So, for instance, if you don't have access to renewable energy, understanding that kind of access and ensuring energy equity is something that you care about, so then you're more likely to be engaged, and then we can think about building power to help pass these policies. So when we think about, policy design, what this would look like, I think about two things that are kind of happening now at the Biden administration that I think are promising, aside from the fact that it seems that legislation right now is a totally hot mess. But so one, of course, is the Justice 40 initiative, which we'll talk about later, but dedicating funding to disadvantaged communities is a way that we can think about equitable policy. We need to move away from this universality idea that we can have one policy that applies to everybody and we'll have equitable outcomes, right? That doesn't address some of what Professor Carley was talking about in terms of recognition justice, that people have historic burdens and historic disproportionate impact. So, targeted investment towards disadvantaged communities then can start to move us towards equity. The second thing that I think is less discussed is that, there's the President Biden produced this executive order on whole of government approach. And I think this is also something that is we need to start thinking more about, because the climate crisis cannot be siloed, right? It will affect every impact of our society and our economy. And as such, our attempts to, address it need to be whole of government. So we need to engage, do cross-administrative, cross-agency coordination to ensure that we have a holistic approach to both equity and also to decarbonization. And when we think also about equity in this, when we think about just transition, for instance, as my colleague Manuel Pastor says, we need to think about it more as a transition to justice. So in addition to the modeling about the energy and the technical side of decarbonization, right, a lot of these reasons that we have inequitable disparities is because of drivers that are not necessarily energy based, right? They're not really dealing with energy source, but more about what causes inequity and inequality in our society. So things like wages, things like household income, access to jobs, right? These all cause inequitable conditions that then are exacerbated when we think about things like energy and decarbonization. So in some sense, expanding out what we think of in energy justice to beyond just, energy systems and energy sources, but what is really causing inequity, and then understanding that those are also climate issues, even though they don't seem to be climate issues. So for instance, I do a lot of work with labor unions. So, the right to organize is actually a climate issue, because the more that we can organize the renewable energy industry, the more fossil fuel workers will be, willing and open to making the transition away from fossil fuel jobs to energy jobs. So kind of expanding out what we think of when we think about in terms of energy justice. And then briefly, I'll just talk about, what I think about when you think about metrics and objectives is that, policy design, it really is kind of the devil is in the details. So when we think about even something like Justice 40, if you have something for the benefit for a community versus a benefit in a community is a big difference, right? So a benefit for a community, for instance, in California's cap and trade program, it means that you can do spending on a transit line that goes through a disadvantaged community, and then the whole cost of that transit line is considered as a benefit for the community, even though a very small slice is actually being directly spent in community. But if we think about the policy design where it's a benefit in community, where the spending is directly in communities, right, that has a much bigger impact, has a much bigger holistic approach, and then actually does start to move us more towards equitable policies. So I'll eager to hear what Professor Nock has to say. So I'll end there, and thank you again for having me today.
Thank you, Professor Cha. And Professor Nock?
So just to build on what Sanya and Mijin have addressed so far, I do want to kind of build on those definitions and different ways that I've seen in the literature about ways to address some historical inequities. So when I think about energy justice and kind of think broadly about the goal of justice, it is to fix the system to reduce inequalities. And I think that one of the biggest challenges is kind of sometimes we skip the step where we ask people, what inequalities are you trying to address, right? And then trying to get on the same page and understand why certain people are using different mechanisms and kind of approaching the system or approaching energy justice solutions in a different way. And so I think that a lot of times a big part of this challenge is from lack of communication across disciplines, and people are siloed in those disciplines. And so kind of moving forward, I do hope that, as interdisciplinary work becomes even greater, right? We're having a lot of discussions about procedural justice, as Sanya mentioned, with incorporating a lot of different communities, and Mijin's talking about like policy levers, that we are able to have like more discussions, but then also trying to understand where people are coming from and how their lived experiences are shaping kind of how they're viewing energy justice and what needs to be solved. And so then from kind of the broader scope of energy justice, I think that two big sectors of need are equality and equity in terms of access, and then also in terms of capabilities, because there are certain barriers to access that will lead to inequity, such as not owning the roof that you live under, lack of transportation to jobs. But then the capability side of things is, okay, even if you could get to the job in a reasonable distance, assuming you had a car, do you have the car? Do you have the capability to use that car to get to your job? Do you actually have the money? So assuming that you own the roof that you live under, do you have the money to, or the capability to adopt a solar panel? And so then we kind of have these kind of bigger streams there. And then of course, when we are thinking about ways to address it, modelers are going to come in and there's going to be disagreement about where to put in the model. And we have to understand how that bias and that modeler's bias will lead to different outcomes, even if you're trying to address the same problem. But putting it in the objective function of an optimization versus a constraint versus the data will lead to vastly different areas, just like how with policy levers to address energy justice problems, like if you have one designed for homeowners versus renters, you're going to lead to vastly different solutions and different implications of that. So so one of the questions was to talk about what work has been done. And I think that we could spend all day just reviewing the literature. So one of the things that I kind of saw early in my career was this paper by Kirsten Jenkins and Ben Sovacool, just kind of laying out the systems level energy injustices and how those might appear differently if you're looking from a procedural lens versus a restorative justice lens versus a distributional lens. And so that kind of was really good just for helping people have discussions about definitions. And then of course you have the work of Tony Reams and Dominic Bednar, who were looking at how the US doesn't actually have a definition, or at least at the time they wrote the paper, doesn't have a definition of energy poverty that they use officially, and how not having a consensus to address it is another large problem. And so when we are kind of looking at moving forward to addressing energy poverty, one thing I will challenge all the engineers to do is not to lose sight of the people, because at the end of the day, we are designing these systems so that people can use them. And including that in a model is very challenging, but we can't run away from that, right? And then we also need to be really clear on the limitations of our models, because there is spatial granularity that Sanya had mentioned, where we don't normally look at the household level, and we're trying to have a national level model and say something about the people, right? And there are going to be limitations, and instead of running from those, we need to try to address those head on.
This is great. Thank you so much, Professor Nock. And while we're waiting for a few of the questions to percolate in the Q&A function, I'll start with this one. There can be an enormous tension between optimality and quantitative analysis, and actually a push on the policy front on distributional environmental justice issues. So I'd love to hear from the three of you on what's the balance, really. If we're waiting to get the research and the analysis completely right on the quantitative level, it may close the window on actually informing some of the policies that are being discussed or designed or considered. What's your take on that? Where should we head as a research community?
I'll try to take a stab, and that is that I think you're right on. I think that there's a lag, and we need to not let that lag paralyze us. And there are things that we can do to fill in that lag in the interim. One is maybe just start with very basic metrics of identifying which communities are the most affected, and thinking about tracking for success, evaluation, and monitoring over time with different initiatives such as the Justice Party Initiative. Another thing we can do is just gather individual household level data in order to tell a more compelling or interesting story. And that is, through some of the work that Destenie is working on, for example, and I can obviously let you share more, but just in tracking people through looking at utility data and thinking about people's actual behavioral patterns, and in some of the work that we're working on with surveys and looking at energy insecurity and how households are dealing with issues of energy insecurity and how they cope. To interviews with people who have been disconnected from the electric grid. I mean, all of these smaller projects can build evidence and can build data that can then be used as inputs once we have the modeling capabilities ready in the long run.
One of the things that I think about with energy systems is that one of the challenges with getting an offshore wind farm off the coast of Massachusetts was all the environmental impact assessments that were required to be done before you could actually build that wind farm. And, part of me wonders why we care a lot about birds and bats, but we're not going to do people impact assessments before we allow different power systems to be built and require those to kind of inform these different decisions, right? Like, I mean, birds and bats and fish and whales. And I mean, these environmental impact assessments are very expensive, but a lot of money is put into there. And a lot of people, there's like, BOEM that kind of regulates it. And I think NOAA sometimes has some jurisdiction there with regulating those, but it is important and it shouldn't be ignored. And I think that, we care about the environment. We want to make sure our wildlife have good habitats, but we should also make sure that people have good habitats too. And so doing that does require time, but it's more expensive and it takes a lot more time to try to fix a system that you've already invested so much money into, as opposed to building it in the kind of a more equitable way from the beginning. And at the end of the day, you can only do as good of work as you have data for and that you have knowledge for, and you have to do the best that you can with what you have. But sometimes I think that there is this big trade-off of the climate is happening now, climate change is happening now, but also people are suffering now. And we need to make sure that we are balancing those two things.
I'll just add, I'm a qualitative researcher. So just to make a pitch for that, because, when I hear things about optimizing research and data, but the reason why recognition justice is part of energy justice is because communities have been facing these burdens for a long time. So they actually do know what they need already, right? There might not be a model for it, but EJ communities, environmental justice communities that have borne this historic burden, they actually do know what they need. They do know what's causing the problem, and they know they know what they need. So I think that this is really the pitch for an interdisciplinary mixed methods research, because talking to people who are suffering the burden will give you the data that you need to know what kind of policies that we should be advancing. I think research and analysis, of course, is important to make the case, but in fact, the case has been made. I think, we're just not doing it.
That's great. Thank you so much, Professor Cha. So another question is really, several of you very generously pointed out to literature from others and recent work in this space. I'm extremely interested in learning from you. So in your recent publications and work, what was one of the last findings and pieces that you researched on that you think all of us should know about? Kind of one sentence on what that paper was about and the key finding.
So in mine, we have a preprint that's under review right now that is called The Energy Equity Gap, Unveiling Hidden Energy Poverty. And we were working with a utility company to identify who is limiting their energy consumption. And this, we believe, is a hidden form of energy poverty. And so let me just provide an example. If you're in your house and it's super cold outside, but you are turning down that thermostat to potentially unsafe levels, maybe you're worried about your pipes freezing, but you feel like you can't spend any more money on it, then you might be on the verge of a disconnection because you are kind of overspending, but also you're limiting your energy consumption. So you wouldn't be having a high energy burden. And so you would actually be missed by the energy burden measure. You'd be missed by the disconnection measure, but you'd still be experiencing a form of energy poverty. And we have been finding that, at least for our air conditioner usage analysis, that low-income groups wait about 6 to 8 degrees longer than high-income groups to even turn on their air conditioning unit. And so this energy limiting behavior is a kind of like a new form of energy poverty. And so my one tagline is that when we are trying to address energy poverty and energy justice, there are multiple dimensions that we need to approach it from, because one measure will not address all of the burdens and potential harms that people are experiencing.
I'll go next. In our recent work, we've been tracking energy insecurity, and we've tracked this over the course of the pandemic. Every few months, we go back and interview or survey and also subsequently interview some of them, the same families across the United States. And what we find with a representative sample is that millions of Americans face conditions of energy insecurity. And that is defined as the inability to pay one's bill or to avoid being disconnected from their service provider. And over the first year of the pandemic, energy insecurity rates skyrocketed. Despite having disconnection protections in place, moratoria in place in many states over certain months during that time. And we've found that households of color are significantly more likely to be disconnected from their service providers. Over the span of May 2020 to 2021, we found that households that identify as Black are 3 times more likely to be disconnected from their service provider than a household that identifies as white. And households that identify as Hispanic are 4 times more likely to be disconnected from their service providers than white households.
I'll just talk a little bit about the Just Transition Listening Project, which is a research collaborative that conducted 100 interviews with people who either face transition or who have experienced transition to kind of understand what are the challenges that we face as we look to transition for this energy transition. And I would say the one sentence takeaway is that, justice and equity concerns really matter, that people are less engaged in greenhouse gas emissions reductions or various policy design, but what they're very concerned about is how they're going to feed their families. And so, understanding that where people are coming from and, moving more towards a just society is actually a climate issue.
Very well. I have a question from the chat. I'll direct this one to Professor Nock, with the other one chiming in, but how do we use one of the existing workhorse models like NEMS or the EIA, AEO's related work to encourage thinking about energy justice? And I'll add to this question, should that be the route?
I think one of the biggest challenges with these large-scale national energy planning models is trying to disaggregate it and downscale it to the people level, right? Because at the end of the day, it is about people. And I know that there's some work on that with the Genome Project and the Repeat Project out of Princeton. And so as we are, I think that there is an opportunity for these models to kind of work with, I guess the tagline now is people impact assessments. So if we are having these models and we're trying to use them to do like national energy transition planning, then once the optimization is solved or the model is finished solving, we should actually do that impact assessment and try to downscale that to where the people are, the census tracts, try to look at where the pollution emissions might go, how costs might change. And we can do that on the back end to try to inform how different changes at the national level will trickle down to the local level. So kind of like if we're modeling national, but then thinking local, right? And then as we are kind of rerunning the analysis, maybe now we're going to try to tweak it, like put a constraint on, we don't want any one region's emissions to be higher than X, because, you know, that is something that we just feel like is really terrible for health concerns, for example, or we don't want the costs in any one region to increase more than X%. And so now you need to rerun the optimization, but you're going to use that impact assessment to inform. And of course, you will need to, you know, do some calibration, make sure you try to run it historically and try to like test it out. But I think that there is an opportunity to connect these national models with more like local impact assessment models.
I think I'll just add that I think that there's a huge role for who the analyst is and what the analyst is thinking about. And if we hold as an objective in our minds that there will be no sacrifice zones, that means no, you know, populations where people bear a disproportionate amount of the burden. And if we set that as our objective, or the other objective might be actually mentioning the Reams paper, right? Dominic and Tony's paper about energy as a basic good, as a right. And if we can recognize that energy is a right that everybody should have access to in a reliable, consistent, and maybe even sustainable energy way, then that is an objective that we hold as analysts. And yes, sure, we can build these into our models as well, but we can also just say that it's unacceptable to pursue anything that comes out of our models if they violate these criterion.
Thank you so much, Professor Carley. I think that both of you started answering this set of questions. I'll bundle a couple together, but when we're thinking about those different dimensions related to distributional effect and environmental justice in the context of decarbonization, this may mean displacement of or changes of jobs, a redistribution of income, air pollution consequences changing. So one question is, to what extent should we include these things explicitly in the objective function and quantifying that versus added as constraints? And how do we keep all these different aspects in mind? So this is a challenging question and putting on the modeler's hat as we speak. And as Professor Carley mentioned, the model will have a very important role, but I guess, would you at least chime in on whether this should be something where we aim to establish things as part of the objective function in those models, or as potentially constraints that have to be met, which will lead to very different answers?
So I guess I can chime in. I think that kind of like on the face value, it seems like a challenging question, but actually I think that in the broader sense, this question is about how do we tackle multiple objectives and including that into the modeling framework. And if you're putting it in the objective function versus putting it in the constraints, it's actually there, it doesn't really matter, because those are both a multi-criteria, well, actually a multi-objective tool. There's a book by Jared Cohen that actually says that putting one of your objectives in the constraints is called the constraint method for multi-objective optimization. And so then, you know, you're kind of bounding it, and to do the sensitivity analysis on that objective, you would actually just be changing that bound on that objective and then seeing how it changes the solution space. Now, if you wanted to include it in the objective function, then you would have to make sure that those everything had the same units, right? And then you're going to use the weighting method. You're going to give different weights to different objectives, and you're going to see how that changes the solution space again. So at both, you're trying to get a sense of how the solution space changes. I think that the types of objectives that we want to include are very important and need to be thought of. So for example, in the developing world, we tend to use a lot of models that are similar to the United States, where it's a least cost model. We're going to project demand, build a system. But the actual objective typically in developing countries where energy access is very low is to increase a social benefit. And we do not have like Todd Levin from Argonne and I and my advisor Aaron Baker had looked at, well, if we had a utility function as that objective, then how does that change the modeling? And then we constrained the cost, again, using the constraint method, to look at how different costs and kind of least costs versus other costs relating to different solution spaces. So in a broad sense, multi-objective optimization is a challenge. There's lots of books on that. But at the end of the day, I think that the biggest challenge is to recognize that if your optimization model gives you a solution, that does not mean that that's the best solution. It only means that's the best solution for the constraints and objectives that you've included in the model at that time.
I love that answer. I'll just add quickly that I think it's an all of the above. I think that we need to do better to create data to go into our models, to ask the right questions, to gather the right metrics, to really provide data that give information about households and individual experiences. I think that we need to do better about building these into our models themselves. And I think we need to do better about examining our own biases as analysts and determining some important, as I said before, some important criteria by which we make decisions as well, and include other people in the process.
Thank you. Moving on to issues related to labor and jobs, I was wondering if Professor Shah could tell us a little bit about what are the likely most important implications if we move to decarbonized systems to different types of labor, and perhaps starting with issues related to the United States, but also globally.
Well, that's a big question. I think, one of the issues is that it's not just that we have fossil fuel jobs, which are, that will have to go away, but the impact that they have regionally. So for instance, in the US, coal is only in a few regions, but the impact that it has in those regions is great because it's often the only employer in those regions. So I think this is also probably true globally, right? Like coal mines tend to be in small communities where most everybody is engaged in either coal mining or the most of the economic benefit is coming from the coal mine. So when you remove the mine, it's not as if there are other industries that can then come and take its place. And I think it's just another example, we just have to think a little bit more broadly. So for instance, I think a lot of people make the mistake of saying, well, we'll just have all these climate jobs or renewable energy jobs that will take place. And of course, renewable energy is a growing sector, especially for employment, because a lot of the things that we need still need to be built. So we need to build large scale, utility scale solar. We need to build wind farms, all those things. But they won't necessarily be built where fossil fuel resources currently exist based on how resources are distributed geographically. So even in a state like Wyoming, for instance, where I've done some research, the coal is in the northeast northeast corner, and the wind is in the southwest corner. So you can't necessarily say, one thing that we learned from the Just and Listening project is that a lot of economic policy is developed thinking that people will move to opportunity. But we found is that, for instance, in the deindustrialization is that people don't move, they just stay in place, and without opportunity, they just become poorer and more desolate. So I think, understanding, what regional economic development can be done, starting that work now, because if we think about the drawdown period over 10 years, that means we have to ramp up industries in 10 years so that we can have this employment replacement taking place. And the final thing I will say is that right now, a lot of policy for renewable energy and fossil fuel development is on job training, thinking that we have to retrain fossil fuel workers into other industries. But in fact, it's better for us to lead with job creation so that people have jobs to be transitioned into, right? After the last recession, we trained a bunch of people for green jobs, quote unquote, that then didn't materialize. So, the training part can come later, but what we really need to be focusing is on job creation. And so finding out and thinking through economic development opportunities in those regions.
That's great. There is here one more question that I'll actually read directly from the chat. This is a beautiful question from John Wyant on how much of the challenge here is the application of welfare economics by modelers without remembering or caring about side payments required to achieve Pareto optimality. The fact that losers can be compensated by winners, making everyone better off, does really not do much good if the check is habitually stuck in the mail.
Yeah, I kind of want to be like, boom. Yeah, that's exactly right. And literally, actually, we found with our energy and security work that this check that was sent to households hardly received the households. It was a shockingly low rate of households that actually received the check. So my answer would be, we may think that we're compensating, but the compensation is often an afterthought. And if it ever happens, it obviously rarely actually includes the communities that were disadvantaged in the first place. And it's not actually directed towards the things that they need going forward.
I think that one of the other challenges for energy justice and I guess energy equity is that if you feel like you're on the losing end of equity, then that's often when you get very vocal opponents to it. So for example, like if people feel like they're losing their jobs, but they're not going to get a better job, or their prices are increasing, but the subsidies are not, they're not able to access them, right? And maybe you're trying to have an equitable policy and you're giving more, I guess, subsidies to low income communities, but then people that are feeling left out of that may, kind of be upset. And that is a big challenge there, because oftentimes those that are able to be more vocal are maybe upper middle class or more middle class as opposed to low income communities. And so then their voices don't get heard. Then they don't get to shape the policies. And then they're also now not even, as Sanya mentioned, not receiving the benefits, right, that they were originally promised. And so I think that is a big challenge of needing to, sometimes I think we need to take a step back and actually identify the losers and try to do that in a more proactive manner. And then instead of having to compensate them, we should design the system so that hopefully they will not need to be compensated, right? And I think that, again, that goes back to, instead of trying to build the system super quick and then fix all the problems because we didn't take the time to look at them, we should actually try to kind of predict problems and address them as we're building, because it's more expensive to address them down the line.
There is a question on whether there is work being done to collect energy inequity data in some sort of central repository.
I'll take a stab at that. Yes. So energy inequity, are we thinking specifically energy insecurity, or are we thinking all forms of equity?
The question doesn't specify, and I think you can take it as all forms.
Okay. Well, maybe I'll take it the other one because that's easier. In terms of energy insecurity data, there are efforts. So the residential energy consumption survey, I think it is REX. I might have messed up one of the letters there. Is gathered by the Energy Information Administration every 5 years. And so that is a source of data. However, there's a new source of data that we are gathering just during the pandemic. I think it was an effort led by Markey, which is through the census. It's the Pulse survey. And we can actually see by state, by week, what the rates of energy insecurity are. So that is a more consistent measure of data gathering. Beyond that, there's just so many forms of energy equity. So there are some data gathering efforts in some domains and not others, I would argue.
I do think that with kind of smart meter data and like large amounts of ability to data share, I think that it is changing. There's the LEAD tool as well. That kind of looks at energy insecurity or / affordability. But I think that in general, I feel like I've noticed a broader kind of need to collect data and need for data sharing. I think also smart meters kind of allows for that. Like there's the ComEd data set that you can actually purchase and try to look at their anonymous energy users and kind of use that smart meter data to identify how people are experiencing energy. And then there's there's some other companies that I think, like Google's solar rooftop project, just kind of thinking about who can access solar, and then if they did have it on the roof, how much energy could they use from it? And so that's I think another kind of nice data set that I've been seeing.
So moving on to the next question, Soli Siddiqui asks, the concepts of equity and justice have distinctly different definitions. Can you give an example of how energy equity considerations are different than energy justice considerations in both qualitative and quantitative research?
So if we go back to the more general definitions, equity would be giving people the tools they need to overcome injustices, and justice is actually fixing the system that is causing the inequities. And so in equity, you are giving people tools to overcome the inequitable system, but in justice, you're actually more focused on fixing the system. So The second point of that question, I mean, that's huge. So, there is, representation issues, marginalization, like, are you kind of having poor air, not lack of jobs? What's the lack of jobs? So I think that equity and justice in terms of how to address them needs to, that's why we need to have a lot of voices at the table, because again, people are going to experience it in very different ways. But yeah, I think that, the biggest one is kind of the tools aspect versus the addressing the systematic inequalities aspect.
Yeah, that's great. I think of equity as the process by which we reach justice, right? So you can't have a just outcome with an inequitable process or inequitable tools. So equity puts us on the path towards justice.
Good. Another question from the audience is to what extent do vertically integrated utilities contribute to energy inequity?
Who wants the hot potato?
So I guess one of the things that kind of stuck out to me in this question is that if I'm thinking about a vertically integrated utility or a more regulated one versus a deregulated electricity market, I don't think that either one will inherently reduce the inequities, because each of them can drive them. So I think that one challenge here is to make sure that we remember that technological solutions do not guarantee equitable outcomes, right? Because it's all about how that technology or how that policy is impacting the people and how people interact with that technology or policy. So in a vertically integrated utility, I think, or like regulated one, then there is the possibility that, you're setting the rates, right? You're making sure those rates don't increase too much. And that can actually help lower inequities, because, the price will be capped at something. In a deregulated market where the market's determining the electricity price, then you might have instances like Texas, right? When winter storm, right? There's huge inequities in the reliability. Now, all of a sudden, you don't have that much supply. And now people are seeing like thousands of dollars on their bills, which is just going to further widen that inequity. And it's like life and death, I'm not going to forego my energy because I, don't want to pay this bill. I don't have a choice. And that's, again, another challenge or another problem with not recognizing energy as a basic need, especially as we are electrifying everything, right? The heating, the transportation, the healthcare there.
I might just add that I think, especially on the topic of energy insecurity, that it's important that utilities are held accountable and that they think deeply about who among their populations or within their populations are being disconnected more than others, and what kinds of services they can put in place and what kind of trust they can build with those communities to ensure that they don't end up in the very desperate situation of being disconnected.
So,
or even,
go ahead.
Or even having their equipment fail, right? Like with New Orleans having that transmission line fail, and then that's now a maintenance issue, and it has really nothing to do with the market, but just kind of making sure that companies are being held accountable to maintain their infrastructure as opposed to being solely profit driven.
So I'd like to ask each of you what I would call the Granger Morgan question. If you have the 30-second elevator ride with your favorite leadership member of one of the agencies, take EPA or DOE, what would you tell them as the key priorities and focus of attention for their agency? And I'll start with Professor Carley.
Honestly, I think it's a problem to identify just one group, that these inequities are so profoundly overlapping, and there are certain communities that just are burdened time and again by not having access to technologies, by not having access to the infrastructure to have energy, by losing their jobs, by not having access to the jobs in the first place, by living next to the highways and experiencing the air pollution. I mean, it's routinely, we know from enough empirical evidence that it's routinely the same communities that are facing these burdens. So I almost think that it's a mistake to just hone in on one problem that needs to be solved as the highest priority.
Yeah, I would agree. I would also say that, I guess my 30-second pitch would be that regulators need to regulate. We keep looking for new ideas, new policies, but in fact, we have the framework now if we just implemented it and enforced it. So EPA has regulatory authority over greenhouse gases, right? We could actually reduce greenhouse gases through the EPA. We have a lot of regulations that are just not implemented or enforced. So I think what my 30-second pitch would be is that the government should use the tools that they have. Regulators should regulate, and we should be enforcing and ensuring that these laws are being held and people are being held accountable, as we've talked, as the panelists have said. There's a lot of unaccountability that's happening with that's causing a lot of injustice, and we have all the tools that we need. We just have to use them.
And I think that for mine, it would be that really when we're working for this system, we need to, one, recognize people's different experiences and different historical interactions with the energy system, and then have multiple types of policies and mechanisms for addressing the many different forms of poverty, because one form is not one form should not dominate the other. Poverty is poverty, and we need ways to identify that complexity and also address that complexity. So for example, like I grew up near a nuclear power plant, so I didn't really think about like air pollution emission issues associated with the power system growing up. But the research says that, a lot of Black communities live near air pollution emission problems. So sometimes people assume that I will understand and I will have lived that experience. And I'm like, I haven't, I don't know that experience. Now I have lived the disconnections and the high energy burden experience. And that, I think, is why we need multiple and diverse voices at the table to try to learn from each other. And so really to think about, who is in power and who's guiding these discussions, and are we having multiple types of lived experiences trying to address these inequities, because we do need people that experience the system in different ways to actually identify current problems. As Mijin pointed out, they know the problems, they just need to have a space to be heard and also have that kind of voice that they're bringing to the table be valued in energy transition discussions.
Professor Nock, I think you're already heading in that direction in this last answer, but I'm wondering if we can now move to, there is a question with a specific state like West Virginia, and asking how can energy justice issues be addressed in states like West Virginia or Wyoming with strong entrenched energy interests. So would there be any suggestions of processes and how to go about dealing with those issues in those specific contexts?
I think that that's a kind of a broad question about just the challenge of innovation and changing systems. So, with industrialization and kind of farmers losing their jobs, and then when you look at manufacturing and automation coming in and people losing their jobs, and now we are experiencing that same thing in the energy sector. And so I think, I think I would actually defer to Mijin, because I think she has a wealth of experience in this. I am new in the community engagement space, as you said in my bio. I'm an engineer by training, so I'm trying to make sure I'm interacting with the people and integrating them into the models. But the things that we're seeing now are not solely unique to the energy sector in terms of the risks of people losing their jobs and experiencing economic poverty. And I think that we need to try to make sure that we are always looking back and looking forward and learning from past kind of challenges.
Yeah, that's great. I don't really have much to add except that exactly that, right? Like we have a history of unjust transition. This is just the latest transition that we are facing. And I think it often gets seen as like there are these pockets in West Virginia and Wyoming that are virulently against the energy transition, which is true to a certain extent. But the biggest obstacle that we have is actually fossil fuel power, right? That is the biggest obstacle to the energy transition. So when we think about, to be honest, coal miners in West Virginia don't have that much power. It is the coal companies that are really driving the policies. So, community visioning exercises, they're doing a lot of this in Appalachia, actually. And I think that there are lots of people who are in these communities that don't want to live a coal miner's life anymore, right? Coal mining is very dangerous. There's lingering, lasting health effects from it, but there's no other opportunity. So when we, it's who has the burden for this transition? It shouldn't be the people who have borne the burden of the fossil fuel economy, right? It should be us or others or other forces that then, are understanding and planning for the transition. But we keep looking to the people who are kind of suffering the impacts of it to guide the path. And certainly directly impacted stakeholders should be responsible, should have a meaningful engagement and be at the table so that they can then plot their future, right, and have a say in what their future looks like. But when we think of in terms of, what is the problem, what is the factor that needs to be overcome, it's really fossil fuel power.
I'll just add on top of that, if I may. Oh, go ahead.
Oh, go ahead.
I was just going to add that just to reinforce the coal miners don't have power. I mean, this is a situation in many of these communities where the coal companies have been the primary source of all economic development, of all social events, of the sports teams for young, for high school and for young children within the community. And when these industries go under, that entire fabric disappears, that the communities no longer have the tax base, they no longer have the social opportunities, and they no longer have the jobs that they started when oftentimes they were in high school. They left high school in order to pick up a job because their father had the job and their grandparent had that job. And this was what they were told by the coal company, that they were guaranteed a job that was lucrative and that would support their family for the rest of their lives. So I think it's just, we oftentimes think about technologies, we oftentimes think about the transition in terms of, moving away from coal and towards these other things, but we're not thinking about the sacrifices that these families and these communities have made, that America has lived on the backbone of them by consuming the coal. And when we pull it out, their entire communities, their entire family operations just change fundamentally.
And I was just going to make a quick plug for a nice book for anybody that wants to dive deeper into this. I like the book Diversifying Power, Why We Need Anti-Racist and Feminist Advocates in Energy Policy and Climate Change Discussions.
We're getting towards the end of this conversation. I learned a lot through all of you, and I think the audience did too. I was wondering if you have any final words of wisdom, and mainly for graduate students and undergraduate students that are interested in this area and coming into this field of questions on where to get started. Is there a community that is emerging where these discussions are really prominent and that they should be aware of? So, and that actually came from a question from the audience, and I'll just add that hopefully this macro energy systems group will provide more opportunities, and that this is the beginning of a discussion, not the only discussion on justice and distributional effects related issues. But back to our panelists for a last 30-second comment on this.
I'm going to take a shot at it. And Destenie, I hope that you're not mad at this. Destenie has a forthcoming paper by Go Forth and Nock. And so my takeaway would be go forth and knock, go knock on that door, go try to open that door and figure out what's behind it, figure out what these issues are and learn. And sometimes you're wrong. Sometimes you run into walls or the room is weird that you walk into, to extend this analogy way too far. But I would just encourage you to really dig into this field.
So I love puns on my name, and I love it when people find one that I never would have found. And so Sanya, good job. And just for those that don't know, my student's name is Go Forth. Her last name is Go Forth. So for me, I think that one of the things I like to tell students is that oftentimes as for the engineers in the audience, we are searching for that one perfect solution that is going to solve everything. And the sooner you give up on that idea, the better off you'll be, because the students in my class normally end up very upset, when I tell them that there actually is no right answer. And we need to try to get better at understanding where we're winning and losing, who's on the winning and losing end, how is that going to potentially impact their lives, and try to approach it from the we need to just get better. And if we are always trying to make the worst community or the worstly impacted community better off, then eventually we will reach this equitable future that we're hoping for, because if we are only as good in our system as the person who is the worst off.
I would just also steal from something that Destenie has mentioned several times, that, you know, you really need different people at the table and you need to talk to different people. And I think, you know, the more that there's ground truthing, the more that there are communities who are impacting and who are impacted that are included in these processes, then you really are doing people, you know, impact statements, right? People, which means you have to talk to them and engage them. And you know, I always think that it's always a very humbling process, because I just learn so much more than, you know, you could read papers all day and you won't really learn what you need to learn until you talk to people.
I would like to really warmly thank you all for all these comments. What a phenomenal discussion. And we look forward to continue to follow all this important work that you're all doing. Thank you everyone that has joined today. There will be a next webinar coming up. Please continue to look at the webpage for more information about macro energy systems. Bye-bye.